I've been kind of jumping back and forth between a couple of series recently, simply because I had two more lessons in my When the Rubber Meets the Road series that we started last year, that for some reason I got waylaid and left the lessons lay under things, and I found the notes and stuff a few weeks ago and thought, wow, that message was not anywhere near complete without, because I had an intention of going where I've gone the last couple of times with it. So next week we'll be back over on What's the Manna with You. But today we're going to wrap up the series, When the Rubber Meets the Road. And what I'd like you to do just quickly is turn in your Bibles to Luke the 17th chapter, which is where we were the last time. As is generally the case, this has been an extremely long series. I realize that. This will be lesson 12. And but the purpose in this, or my design in this, has been for each week to draw upon the previous week, and for each week to prepare you for the next week. So there's been a sequential approach to this in my own heart as we've gone through this, and so consequently we followed a particular course in arriving where we are today. And I want you to be aware of that. I want you to realize that if you haven't been following, and of course some of you couldn't have been because we started it way last year, but if you haven't been following, there may be some things that you're not really ready to understand about what I'm going to say today. But it's because we've been building from week to week. We've started off back in John the 20th chapter, my peace I give unto you, and if you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained. But it was all an answer to establishing peace in the society, in the church, in the family. My peace I give to you, my peace. Peace be with you. Peace be with you if you forgive the sins of any. Remember that way back in lesson 1. And so peace really is a function of forgiveness. And we have developed this series as we've gone on. And but anyway, in the same way though that the last time we refreshed ourselves with the heartbeat of Jesus so that we could take on this passage in Luke chapter 17 that we'll look at again in just a moment, just briefly. And in the same way, today we are going to deal with another particular passage that has been a problematic passage in the church, but it's going to require that you have at least the basic understanding of last week, which required that you have the basic understanding of the previous time when we talked about the heartbeat of Jesus. So hopefully we'll be able to communicate all that today as we go. But now, Jesus almost certainly had a progressive instruction to his disciples. If we think about it, in his day-to-day mentoring of them, we would realize that probably any good teacher would have some kind of a progressive instruction going on. In other words, we don't start with calculus, we start with arithmetic. Isn't that right? There's a progression to learning and understanding things. And Jesus most certainly had a progressive intention and a day-to-day mentoring process that was built upon that particular understanding. However, what we read in scriptures, remember, was many times written down of his teaching decades after his ascension. And so what we read in Scripture cannot necessarily, as we look at all of it, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in particular, cannot necessarily be assumed to be chronological. And I say that because any passage, for instance, or any teaching of Jesus that is taken out of out of that mentoring process that Jesus had in mind, if you understand what I'm saying, taken out of the progression that Jesus had in mind as he taught his disciples, any particular passage that might be misplaced, in other words, taken from position 5 and placed at the front of the line, actually as the first directive regarding this whole forgiveness thing, it can end up being very destructive rather than reparative. Does that make sense to you? In other words, how difficult would it have been, for instance, for you to have been introduced as a first grader to just even basic algebra? It wouldn't have worked, would it? And so we've got to be careful that just because we read something early in one book, one of the Gospels, and later in another one of the Gospels, that we don't get the idea that what we read earlier necessarily was a what do I want to say, a first mentoring of Jesus, a first teaching of Jesus. For instance, well, no, I'll get to the for instance in a minute. So we'll. I don't want to get ahead of myself here. I'll lose where I'm going, But anyway, these last two sessions, today and the one we did on Luke 17, are good examples of passages of Scripture, teachings of Jesus that have been misplaced or misused and have become weapons rather than tools. Remember, everything that Jesus gave us was intended to be a tool for social and familial harmony. Jesus didn't give us anything that was intended to be a weapon of destruction and separation and division. Everything he taught us was intended to be a tool of harmony. Can we agree on that? All right. And then, as we attempt to walk the walk, so to speak, as we attempt to walk the walk, in rhythm with his heartbeat that we talked about last time, we discovered, first of all, or we discover forgiveness might, first of all, be mostly necessary for me, lest a root of bitterness spring up in me and I become a defilement to many, right? Remember that? So sometimes we discover that this whole concept of forgiveness, first of all, has its direct application, its first step application maybe in me. But then as I continue to follow Jesus, what I discover is that there's a goal beyond simply dumping my baggage. In other words, there's a higher purpose, if you will, than even my personal recovery from the ill treatment of others. And that's very important. Jesus wants you to be healed of your ill treatment from others. He wants us to be able to rid ourselves of that baggage that, if it is not discarded, it will spring up in us, as Hebrews says, a root of bitterness, and cause us to become a defilement to many, to everybody around us. And so that's a very important first principle, I guess I should say. It's one of the places that we definitely visited and made our own. But we need to realize that there's something beyond that that's not the final goal, even though that's a very important place along the line. We discover as we continue to follow Jesus that Abba, that Father, has a higher goal, and that higher goal is reconciliation, which means the restoration of fellowship between you and the offender, or the recovery of fellowship between you and maybe I should say the perceived offender, because many times we perceive offense where there is no offense, but we still need to learn to deal with that, all right? And so the Father's goal is reconciliation, which means it's the enabling of the offender to enter into or to return to a healthy relationship. That's what reconciliation is enabling the offender either to be admitted to, if there's someone from outside who was never a part of, or to be restored to a healthy relationship. Is that right? So that's the ultimate goal as we go along. Or we can look at it this way, that it's creating opportunity for assisted healing within the family, within the group, within the society, within the church. That's what reconciliation is, how it's to be understood. And we need to realize, and we need to conclude, I guess, this particular series, even though there's certainly much more that could be said and should be said probably, but we need to conclude with this understanding that the ultimate goal is not you being ridded of the hurt from the ills of other people that have been imposed upon you. And yet that is so very, very important. Otherwise, you're of no value to others around you. And it's not about you being valuable to others around you. I don't mean it that way. But I mean, we have a tendency to, as we always say, hurting people hurt people. And so we definitely want to, learn to forgive for that reason as well. But we need to realize that there is something higher than that. Something beyond that. A greater goal that is to be understood, right? Now, the last time, in preparation for this time, because there was some preparation to a previous time for the last time, right? Okay? But the last time, in preparation for this time, you know, we examined this passage in Luke chapter 17. We're going to look at it just briefly, but particularly with regard to the translation of the word rebuke in verse 17, and verse 3 of chapter 17 here, right? The idea being that our modern understanding of rebuke, you know, our modern understanding says one thing, but what Jesus intended said something entirely different. But our modern understanding, when I say modern, I'm referring to the last couple of hundred years maybe, but the evangelical understanding or the societal understanding of rebuke really has more to do with establishing guilt and assigning the appropriate shame. Isn't that right? Isn't that the idea we get normally? And so consequently, what has happened is we have learned to read our modern concept into what Jesus would have said. But as we reconsidered last time, based on the previous time, the heartbeat of Jesus, we had to discount the modern concept of rebuke. Let's read this passage just real quick, starting with verse 1. He said to the disciples, "It is impossible that no offenses should come, but woe to him through whom they do come. It would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea than that he should offend one of these little ones. Take heed to yourselves. If your brother sins against you, rebuke him. And if he repents, forgive him. If he doesn't, don't." No, that's not what it said. "And if he sins against you 7 times in a day, and 7 times in a day returns to you, saying, 'I repent,' you shall forgive him." I'm not going back over all of that because the entirety of the last message was those 4 verses. And I want you to go and listen to them if you haven't heard it yet. You need to hear it, right? But what we dealt with primarily, or what I wanted to get to last time, was when we imagine Jesus saying this, if we have been brought up in a misplaced mentoring process, we have accepted the idea of rebuke him based on our modern concept of rebuke, to assign blame and to make sure, you know, that the appropriate shame is administered. See, because that's what it's all about in the way we think, right? Okay, so here's the thing that I am going to reemphasize from the last time. This word rebuke is the Greek word epitimeo, and it, like so many other Greek and Hebrew words, has a range of definitions running from positive to negative, which according to Strong's and Vine's and some of these have been inversed so that they would be more in agreement with evangelical Christianity, and they now run from negative to positive, right? But this Greek word epitimeo, now listen to me, this is the word that is rendered rebuke in Luke 17:3. It means to show honor to raise, to establish and raise the value of, and remember it's talking about the brother who has offended you, right? To show honor to raise the honor of, to fix the worth of, to revere, to confirm the identity and the dignity of the one who has sinned against you. Does that sound at all like what we thought rebuke meant? But when we looked at and reconsidered the heartbeat of Jesus, and going back over the many lessons that we've talked about and so many things that we didn't see that we didn't actually discuss in this series, but does any of that sound like the heartbeat of Jesus, the way we do it now? See, epitimeo, the way we've just defined it, represents the heartbeat of Jesus right from the get-go, doesn't it? It's what Jesus always did. What Jesus always did was restore, you know, it was confirm, I should say, really, confirm true identity and restore dignity. Neither do I condemn you, right? Woman, not slut. Woman, not 5 times married. See? Woman, right? He restored. He confirmed. He built up. He edified. That was Jesus, right? And the heartbeat of Jesus is consistent. He doesn't have, as I said last week, an arrhythmia. He doesn't have a premature ventricular contraction, you see. He doesn't have atrial fibrillation. He has a steady pulse. He's in great shape. He wakes up in the morning, 60 heartbeats a minute. Middle of the day, 60 heartbeats a minute. Jesus has got a consistent heartbeat. And if we are going to walk in agreement with the rhythm of his heartbeat, then we have to understand See? That we have actually been seduced into believing things according to modern day societal and therefore evangelical fundamentalist church definition. Okay? So anyway, so epitimeo. Now, think about this. So this is what he has said. So if my brother sins against me, epitimeo. If my brother sins against me, I'm to show honor to him. I'm to raise the value of him in his own sight. I'm to fix that worth. I'm to revere him. I'm to confirm his identity and his dignity. Now think about this. When I pursue, or that course of action, and remember we are to pursue peace with all men, right? So far as it depends upon you, you are to live peaceably with all men so far as it depends upon you. So we're talking about your pursuit of the brother who has sinned against you. And we've been all through that thing of Jesus. When he said brother, he meant adversary. When he said enemy, he meant neighbor, right? So in other words, he was telling us, when you think adversary, here's what I want you to realize, he's your brother. When you think enemy, I want you to remember he's your neighbor. I want you to go into this thing with a brother-neighbor attitude, not a adversary-enemy, right? Talked about that last week. Anyway, so here's the thing. Then, when I go into this, with this particular frame of mind, when I pursue this course of action that Jesus has prescribed here actually in Luke 17:3, the first thing I do is I'm refreshing my own thinking, right? Remember that Paul told us over there in Romans chapter 12 when he was speaking about our dealings with our enemies. One thing he said was to think beforehand how to provide good things for all. Remember that? To think beforehand how to provide good things for all. It says over there, it says, have regard for good things for all men. But I told you that word regard there is a word means to think beforehand. In other words, I'm coming to your house because you and I got an issue. What I need to do before I come to your house, because you see, I'm coming to your house because I'm going to rebuke you, you adversarial enemy jerkwater. See? And as I get in my car, what I'm going to do, if I'm going to follow Jesus, is I'm going to begin to allow my thoughts to be readjusted around what Jesus actually said in epitimeo, right? And so the first thing that I'm going to be doing is adjusting my own thoughts, and I'm going to begin thinking, now wait a minute. Here's what I need to do. When I go to Harvey's house, what I've got to do is I've got to be thinking between now and the time I get to Cheyenne, I've got to be thinking about how to provide good things for Harvey in this thing, right? So the first thing I'm doing is I'm adjusting my own thinking. I don't have anything against Harvey. That's why I used him. The rest of you, no, I don't know. But Harvey's got a clean one. He's clean. Okay? So anyway. So that's the first thing. So in my attitude, what I'm doing is in my attitude. See, this is about me. This isn't about my adversary right now. So what I'm doing right now in my own attitude is, I've already said, I'm replacing enemy with neighbor. That's right. He's my neighbor. He's not my enemy. And I'm replacing adversary with brother. So these are the things I'm doing if I'm going to follow the teaching of Jesus, right? And then secondarily, I'm displacing any sense of inequality. My superiority for having walked the walk, his inferiority for having blown it. So that's the first thing. Next thing I'm doing, I'm displacing any sense of inequality between us, right? And then, consequently, I am eliminating the potential for a behavioral identification to be conveyed. Right? In other words, beginning to identify them according to their transgression. Now, Jenny can tell you that in all the years that I went to prison and ministered, I always began every service and by helping them be distanced from their transgression. We would always go and talk about what Jesus had to say in Matthew 11 when he talked about he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John the Baptist. But yet, of those born among women, none greater than John the Baptist had ever been born. So I always preceded my message to the inmates with the revelation that they were greater than John the Baptist, who was greater than Joshua, greater than Moses, greater than. See? And my purpose in that was this very thing, to restore to them a sense of identity and dignity so that they would not sit there and listen to me with a behavioral identification of themselves. Rapist, child molester, burglar, whatever. See? Because that's the way they've been identified by society, right? And of course, we do the same thing in the church with folks, right? Okay. Anyway, so so consequently, what I'm doing is I'm priming my brother for shameless restoration. Because you know your brother is carrying shame. I used to ask the inmates, how many of you here feel like you've disappointed God? Gee, many, Christmas, every hand in the room went up. And I said, I have to tell you that's an impossibility. Because disappointment is based on you doing something that he didn't see coming. None of you have ever disappointed God. That's true of you, too. See? And so once again, one of the things we have to do is we have to do this, as Jesus said, according to epitomeo. See? We've got to go to honor, to show honor, to revere, to fix and establish their value, their worth, whoever it is. But I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that because this person has offended me. Well, we need to go on here, don't we? All right, but I want you to carry this with us, what we've just talked about, now as we go over to Matthew, the 18th chapter. Because this and only this is going to keep us in the context of the mentoring of Jesus. And that's where we want to be. We want to be in the mentoring process of Jesus. We don't want to be trying to enter into relationship with people using as our first, as our first contact. We don't want our first one to be something that Jesus taught these fellows about after he had already built into them these concepts that revealed his heart. You see what I'm saying? And yet in the church, this is what we've done. There have been many misplaced teachings of Jesus. And by misplaced, I mean they've been taken from position 10 and they've been moved up to to number 1. Here's the thing. Okay, I got all the guys called. See, I just finished calling all 12 of them. I've gathered them to me. I said, follow me. We go down the beach. We sit down on the beach. And I say, all right, now here's the fellas. Over the next several years, I'm going to be teaching you a lot of things, but here's where I want you to begin. If your brother sins against you, go to him and rebuke him. Is that a good place to start? Sounds a little strange, doesn't it, to start right there? Well, they would have just jumped right on the societal norm of the day and gone to town with it, right? Who needs reconciliation when you can inflict more pain, right? Isn't that right? So anyhow, all right, so here we're going to do, in Matthew chapter 18, we've got another one of these passages that has been misused, misplaced, particularly, in this case, we'll see, particularly by the hierarchy of the church, but particularly by the modern church government type of thing. But anyway, but in order to get to that one, we're going to look at some things on either side of it first. So let's go first of all to Matthew 18, and we're going to look at verses 10 through 14. Take heed that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep and one of them goes astray, does he not leave the 99 and go to the mountains to seek the one that is straying? And if he should find it, the one that is straying, assuredly I say to you, he rejoices over that one that is straying more than over the 90 and 9 that did not go astray. We're going to look at that part first. Now, first of all, we find here the emphasis of little ones that we saw only briefly in Luke chapter 17 last time. Okay, but we see a larger emphasis on little ones here. And you can see clearly in Matthew's rendition of this, in Matthew's version of this, the emphasis is on what? On recovery. Isn't that right? On recovery. On recovering who? The one who has gone astray. Now, please don't think of this as the church member who hasn't showed up in church for 4 or 5 weeks. Okay, please don't do that, because then I would be out tracking you down. Somebody, I would never have time to go home. No. Please also, though, do not think of this as a child separated from mother on the playground. As tragic as that is, and as necessary as it would be to immediately go out and seek the one who is lost, that's not what this is about. What I want you to do this week is the same thing we did the last time, as we understood that Jesus was telling us to think differently than what we were thinking about the individual. The words little one here, even though there's probably enough context here to assume that Jesus is maybe talking about children, but the word little one here is not a word that just implies necessarily a child. It just means an undeveloped one, one who hasn't necessarily grown to a particular place, say. So it could mean some other things, but here's what I want you to see. That I believe that what Jesus is saying to us here, listen to me carefully, is that our perception of the vilest offender is to be one that is straying. As difficult as it is for you and I to wrap our brain around this, a child molester to the father is one who is straying. These are children of God, right? The murderer, the rapist, all of those people that we would really truly struggle to follow the teaching of Jesus, the mentoring of Jesus, the procedures of Jesus. But Jesus is again changing our perception. He changed our perception from adversary to brother. He changed our perception from enemy to neighbor. He changed our perception from offender to brother, also there in Luke chapter 17. And here Jesus is changing our perception to the vilest offender to one who is straying. Because that's the heart of the Father. That's the heart of Jesus. To the Father, they are ones who have strayed away from Him, right? That makes sense to you? So again, yes, if a child disappears from mother on the playground, we're going to do everything we can to recover that child. But that's not what Jesus is communicating here. He knows you got enough sense to do that. What Jesus knows we don't have enough sense to do is to consider a child molester simply one who is straying from God and needs to be sought after and brought back and returned to the fold. He knows we don't have enough sense without His direction, to treat an adversary like a brother or to treat an enemy like a neighbor. So He's giving us some directions. You getting this, or are you getting mad and ready to leave? Okay? All right. Now, in that case, all right, then when we look at verse 13, the message is, look at verse 13, the message is that Jesus rejoices more over the restoration of that vile offender, the one who is straying, than He does over our steadfast holy lives. He rejoices more over the restoration of that offender than He does over the fact that you haven't smoked a cigarette, drank a cup of coffee, had a drink of whiskey in all your life. He rejoices more over the return of the offender. Do you know that? This is Jesus talking about the way He and Papa feel about going after the one who is straying. All right, now let's refresh ourselves. Let's go to the other side, and let's go down to verse 21, and let's refresh ourselves to this that you're all familiar with. We've been hearing this one ever since we were little kids in school. Then Peter came to Him and said, Lord, no, who came to Him? Peter. And Peter asked a question, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times. Now, every one of you have asked God at times, do I really have to forgive this person? Or how can I forgive this person? Or you have not said anything to God. You've thought God didn't hear you, and you've said, I'm not forgiving that person. But God heard you. And so He put you and I and Peter all in chapter 18 here. Right? And so He says, Then Peter came to him and said, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Up to 7 times. Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7, 490. Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And when he had begun to settle accounts, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents, but he was not able to pay. As he was not able to pay, his master commanded that he be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and the payment be made. The servant therefore fell down before him, saying, Master, have patience with me, and I will pay you all. Then the master of that servant was moved with compassion, released him, and forgave him the debt. But that servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, and he laid hands on him, took him by the throat, saying, Pay me what you owe. So his fellow servant fell down at his feet and begged him, saying, Have patience with me, I will pay you all. And he would not, but went and threw him into prison till he should pay the debt. So when his fellow servants saw what had been done, they were very grieved and came and told their master all that had been done. Then his master, after he had called him and said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. Should you not also have had compassion on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you? And his master was angry and delivered him to the torturers till he should pay all that was due. All right, now I read that fast because you all know it. Anyway, so as I said at the beginning, Peter was the one who brought all this up. He was the one asking the question to open all this up. And so therefore, Peter becomes the type of the one who owed 10,000 talents, because Peter said, how often shall I, right? Is that right? How often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? So Peter's saying, how often shall I? So he puts himself in a position to be the type in Jesus' story here, right? So he becomes the type of the one who owed 10,000 talents in verse 24, and after being forgiven, went out and found one of his fellow servants in verse 28, and to whom the master's words were spoken in verse 33, should you not also have had compassion on your fellow servant? Right? So in other words, Peter, you, me, we're the ones this story is about. This story is not about the offender, is it? See? We're the ones this story is about, and compassion on the one who is straying is again the heartbeat of Jesus. Isn't that right? See, we got to bring the previous story about the little ones and the one who is straying. We got to bring it on down now. Bring it down here with us. So compassion on the one who is straying is the heartbeat of Jesus. Should we not also have had compassion on our fellow servant as he had upon us, right? Okay. Now, if you have followed me to this point, if you follow, then theoretically, we're ready for the usually misplaced, misused passage that lies in between, all right? So if you go with me back to verses 15 through 17, which is somewhat comparable to what we dealt with last time. Moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you have gained your brother. But if he will not hear you, take with you 1 or 2 more, that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. But if he refuses even to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector. Now, let me ask you first of all, can you see how placing this instruction, at the front of the line might be destructive? Right? If this is the first thing they're told on the beach, right? As they sit there listening to Jesus, who's about to give them their first indoctrination session on following him. This is one of the first things I want you guys to know, all right? If your brother sins against you, I want you to go to him and tell him his fault. I can only ask you this, how well has that worked with your mate? After the bliss, which may have been a night, a week, a month, poor Marilyn only got a few weeks before she began to discover real me after our marriage, right? But how well does it work? Let's go and tell them their fault. That's what they need to hear, right? Okay, you've got that in mind now, how well it worked when you tried it before, right? Okay, now, I want to say something else about this as we get. The fact that later on down here in the 17th verse, it mentions the church. I think it is safe in this particular application here to assume that when he uses the word brother here, he's actually referring to a professing believer, somebody who has aligned themselves at least, with the church to some degree. Now, last time I told you, he just wants us to see every adversary as a brother. And I still hold to that and believe that was part of the mentoring process of Jesus. But here he brings in the church. And so because he brings in the church, I do think he's referring to someone who is at least a professing believer at some level. But nevertheless, this is still not an early or a first step instruction, in the mentoring process of Jesus. This still is way down the line. And if you've been here from the beginning of when the rubber meets the road, you realize that this could not have fit in week 1 or week 2 or week 3. But somewhere along the line, Jesus was preparing them each week, each message, each teaching. Jesus was preparing them. Certainly he was preparing them. He introduced to the fact that if you're going to have peace on earth, you're going to be forgivers. And if you want to eradicate peace, just retain the sins of any. Say, if you want to be without peace in life, if you want to be one who promotes other than peace, then just retain the sins of others. So he started there. Started with kind of a general concept. And then he got down to talking to them about how they could be ridded of all the horrible things that had been stored up in them by the offenses that others had committed against them. Well, isn't that wonderful? That's good. And we all bought into that one, right? Because it was profitable for us. It was beneficial for us. And now he's going someplace that's much harder for us to go because he's dealing with the worm across the street. He's dealing with somebody else now. He's starting to emphasize that it wasn't really all about me all along, even though it was about me. Does that make sense to you? Okay. All right. And of course, again, remember that we're not dealing with, we're not drawing on the social ethic of our present day when we talk about this, and we're not looking to common, modern, authoritarian church government. We're following Jesus, right? Because you see, these verses 15 through 17 have been badly, badly misapplied in the church by those in positions of so-called assumed authority. And this thing has been used to destroy people. Not to reconcile people, but what is the heart of Jesus? Reconciliation, right? That's the heart of Jesus. So these verses work against the heart of Jesus in their modern application, their modern understanding. So we have to understand what's going on here, right? So we're following Jesus, the same Jesus who has already mandated 70 times 7, right? Same Jesus who's already condemned all vengeance and retribution for us. The same Jesus who's told us to honor and communicate value, worth, and reverence to the offender, the brother who sinned against us. The same Jesus who's told us that we are to confirm identity and dignity in the one who has sinned against us. This is the Jesus we're following, not the Jesus of the modern church, not the Jesus that is portrayed, out there in society very weakly, right? So in other words, reconciliation, not further alienation, is our goal. Can we settle on that? It's easy to further alienate. All I got to do is tell Marilyn her fault. And then I can go buy dinner myself somewhere. No, I'm serious. I mean, it's for all of us. So I said, how well has it worked with your mate? Because that's the person we're most aware of their faults, for the most part, right? Okay. All right, so when we go down here to verse 15, then we find this word fault. Now, the word fault then is going to have to take on a conciliatory tone rather than an accusatory ring. So when we hear this word, go to your brother and tell him your fault. If you're hearing accusation, you're not hearing Jesus. If you're hearing reconciliation, you're beginning to hear Jesus, but you still got to deal with it because you have been inundated with fault. In preschool, in elementary school, in high school, at home, in your marriage, at work. Fault has always meant what? Accusation. Okay? Okay. Now, I also want you to notice these words. Notice that it says in verse 15, go and tell him, now look at this, his fault between you and him alone. Now, I know the first thing that you think that means is, and you're partially right, is that you are to go to him alone to tell him his fault. Well, this has a dual meaning, because what this means is you are to go to him and tell him the fault that exists between you and him alone. In other words, this is not a fault that exists between you and a mass of people. That's important to you in just a minute when you're told to get one or two others and go and see him again. So get that straight first of all. He said you go to him and tell him of the fault that exists between you and him alone. It's me and Marilyn. It's our home. It's our personal life. It doesn't include you. It's not Jackie. It's not Georgianne. It's not Harvey. It's me and Marilyn alone, right? Okay. There's a fault that exists between Marilyn and I alone in this case, right? All right. So now what we need to understand is, what is a fault? Well, a fault, we've all heard of the San Andreas fault, right? A fault is a crevice or a crack or a break or a chasm. It's a chasm. So he's talking about a chasm that exists between you and him alone. Wow. Okay, so in other words, here's the thing. We find ourselves on opposite sides of a chasm. Marilyn and I have never been there in our marriage, but I know some of you probably have. I know Larry and Diane never have either, but you know, there's some of you that have been on opposite sides of a chasm in your relationship with your wife, right? Or your husband. That's what he's talking about here. There's a chasm that exists between you and him alone, right? You need to go tell him about it, right? So we find ourselves on opposite sides of a chasm or a gap that needs to be bridged. But now remember, he's the one who strayed. So I can't expect him to provide much to build with, can I? He's the one that strayed. All right, so that means reconciliation falls to me. Just as it fell to Jesus. Just as it fell to Jesus, you see, in bridging the fault between humanity and Trinity. Right? And we heard these words in 2 Corinthians 5 many times. God in Christ reconciling. Well, guess what you have the honor of doing now? You have the honor of hosting God in you reconciling. Isn't that interesting? It's an honor to be able to host, because you see, what are we doing? We're following Jesus. Jesus went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed of the devil. Why? For God was with him. Isn't that right? God is with you. You have the opportunity, the honor, the high honor of hosting God in you reconciling. Wow, is that something? In other words, I get to extend goodness and mercy from my side of the fault. Now remember, sorry, baby, you're just more convenient right now. She's the offender. It should really be the other way around, I realize, but since I'm doing the talking, this is the way it is, okay? Okay? I get to extend goodness and mercy from my side of the fault towards her in good faith that listen to me carefully and see if this doesn't sound like Jesus. In good faith that my grace will find its way to a mind-changing repentance place in her thinking. Doesn't that sound exactly like Jesus? See? His grace extended to us to do what? To produce a mind-changing repentance in our processes of thinking. And remember, Romans 2:4, it is the kindness or the goodness of God that produces repentance or change of mind. Is that right? So here, as I am hosting God in me, reconciling, I get to extend mercy and grace across the chasm in good faith. Why in good faith? Because I am listening to the mentoring of Jesus. I am submitting myself to the mentoring of Jesus. So in good faith, I can extend great mercy and goodness across, believing that my grace extended will find a mind-changing place of repentance in the offender. Right? Okay. It gets worse, folks. Okay. And as I've said, in this case, you know, I'm dealing with a brother who apparently is acquainted with Jesus and should at least, you know, recognize what I'm trying to accomplish. But, listen to me, isn't it strange that it's more difficult to reach out to a Christian than it is to an unbeliever? Listen, I know that in this room today, I know that on the web with us today, there are people who aren't speaking to one another, who have broken relationships with one another. And you avoid each other at the coffee bar. You avoid each other coming in the door and in the parking lot. I told you it gets worse. I warned you, you could have left. You chose to stay. I didn't give you much time. I didn't say time out while people want to leave. Okay? So, telling him his fault apparently doesn't mean to present him with chapter and verse outlining his violation, right? Or, listen to me carefully, or detailing how he's hurt me. Now, one more, or even that he's hurt me. Where the hell did I get the idea that I had to tell people how they'd hurt me? From modern church BS. We think we have to tell them how they hurt us? No. Come on, first of all, they read the offense on your face the minute you did what you did, so even if it wasn't an intended offense, they already know what you think they did. See, that's not what this is about, folks. It's never about. Remember what he said? Peter, you, I, we were the object of Matthew 18, not the offenders. First of all, okay? And now we find ourselves in a situation we need to ask ourselves, is it important that I tell this other individual how they hurt me? Is it important that I even tell them that they hurt me? Well, no, Jesus said. Didn't Jesus say, if you retain the sins of any, they are retained? Well, you know what that means? That means you hold them in your mind long enough to make sure you get to express them before you let them go. All right? Forgive means to send away, lickety-split, light a rocket under, pew! Lift off. That's another thing that, pew! That's what forgive means. Lift off, right? So again, let me say this. Telling him his fault does not mean, right, that we present him with chapter and verse outlining his violation. Well, here in Leviticus 16 it says, right? Let it sink in for a minute. As you think back over all the times that you've had chapter and verse that you could have gone to somebody with, but you weren't quite sure if you were going to get punched in the nose or not, right? Or telling him his fault does not mean that I'm to detail how he's hurt me or even that he has. We have plugged in some things here that have absolutely no business in the teaching of Jesus. Now, taking everything into account that we've learned from Jesus pretty much silences the whole idea of accusation, doesn't it? Sure is quiet here. So it goes more like this, and I would like you to listen to me carefully. I'm just going to give you an example of how it might work. And of course, I practice this regularly with Marilyn. If you think I'm not learning tremendously from this series, you're wrong. All right. It goes more like this. Brother or sweetheart. Don't call your brother your sweetheart, though. Unless he actually is. And more power to you, brother. It goes more like this. Brother, there's a chasm. I realize there's a chasm between you and me. Now listen to these words very carefully, ladies and gentlemen. Brother, I realize that there is a chasm between you and me. What can I do? Did you get those words? Now remember, I'm not the offender. I'm the one who was offended. I'm the one who recognizes that there is now a fault or a chasm between me and another. And so here's the thing. I realize that there's a chasm between you and me. What can I do to restore the fellowship of our relationship? Isn't that what Abba said? What can I do? I know what I can do. I can become flesh, dwell among them, take upon myself all of the shame and the humility. All of the shame and the depreciation of their humanity. Isn't that what he did? He said, what can I do? He didn't say, this is what you must do. This is what you must do in order to restore relationship with me. No, he said, what can I do? And he did it. See, we can't take ourselves and put ourselves in a different act than the act of God. We can't say, well, he acted this way, but we are entitled to act this way. Right? Okay. Well, then we go to verse 16. All right, Mike, I did that. And he didn't hear me. All right, then it says, take with you, now read carefully, follow along as I read this. I want you to make sure you see the wording here. Take with you one or two more, that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every accusation may be confirmed. What? Oh. Now, remember I told you a while ago that it was important that you remember that there is a fault between you and him alone. So in other words, this 1 or 2 others that you're taking along should have, doesn't work this way in the modern church, I apologize, should have no understanding of what the problem is between the 2 of you. It doesn't say take 1 or 2 others that you have told how Harvey sinned against you. Don't get yourself a support system that already knows what you believe about this person's sin, right? He didn't say that. See, that's the way every accusation is confirmed. When we take 1 or 2 others, well, if it's a fault between you and me alone, see, if Don and I have a chasm between us, and I don't tell anybody else, how can I take 1 or 2 others with me? So it's necessary that I tell some other folks. Preferably folks that are going to stand with me and condemn Don. Right? Because it's my position that's really important here. All right? Now, come on. I mean, I'm just talking about the way it's been presented, folks. Because if you think about the way it has been, how it has operated, okay, we got to find 2 more people that know about the sin, and they're going with us. It doesn't say every accusation, does it? Here's what it says. Every word, rhema. Now, I realize that you can take the context of this and say something different with it, but rhema, as I told you before, is really defined as the utterance of the Logos. Now, I know they used it in general terms as well throughout the New Testament, but rhema is the utterance of the Logos. Who is the Logos? The Word made flesh, Jesus. That's who we're dealing with, right? So what is he saying here? Take with you 1 or 2 others, that everything that the Master has instructed us to do in the process of reconciliation might be confirmed to have taken place. Doesn't have a damn thing to do with the accusation. That's not even supposed to be a part of this. What's part of this is I'm going to take along 1 or 2 more who also share the heartbeat of Jesus and the same agenda, reconciliation. So that's what I've got to do. I've got to find 1 or 2 others and say, listen, there is a chasm, and I'm not going to tell you anything about it, that exists between Don and myself. And you know what? Really what I want more than anything else is to restore the relationship and the fellowship between Don and I. Will you come with me to help confirm that? Will you let him know that in case there's anything that in him is burning in shame and fear, that not only do I receive him back, but you receive him. See how this is working? It's working a little different. It's hard to wrap our mind around some things we've been so... are you getting anything out of this? Yes. Okay. Because I'm expecting a lot of you to reach out to me in conciliatory ways after the service is over today. All right. So I'm taking... So one or two more, okay, 1 or 2 more who employ the same methods. What's the method? Epitomeo, honor, revere, establish identity and dignity, value, and worth, right? That's the method. So we have an agenda, which is reconciliation. We have that every word, that every rhema, that every utterance of Jesus, that everything that Jesus has taught us to do regarding the process of reconciliation would be confirmed. So what I'm really doing is taking these guys along to make sure I do it right, not to make sure this person feels the accusation. I'm taking them along. I don't like this word in the way it's misused, but I'm taking them along to keep me accountable, not to make the offender accountable. Right. That make sense? Yes. Because, I know that when I get around Don, the first thing I'm going to want to do is slap him in the face. Right? He's bigger than me, so I probably wouldn't do that. But anyway, I know who I am. I know how I can be in one thing going somewhere, and then I get home, I can be driving all the way home thinking, man, I was really, I shouldn't have said what I said to her, and I walk in the house, and she doesn't smile, and I'm mad again. You know how it works. You've all been there. Don't look at me like I'm the only sinner in the room. Okay? Anyway, All right. So, in other words, take one or two more who employ the same method, this epitomeo, that every conciliatory, honoring, identity-confirming directive of Jesus may be established in this brother. That make sense to you? All right. Well, then we get down to verse 17. Well, Mike, this bozo didn't hear them either, right? I'm not referring to you, Don, so don't take that word bozo out on me. I got off of Harvey a long time ago. Move around the room. So I think it's just about time, that we shared our brother's guilt, with the pastor, the elders, and the gossips of the church in order to achieve public humiliation and to justify his or her excommunication from the group. Because once again, ladies and gentlemen, you may be laughing, but this is the way it's been used in churches. Can anybody say that they've ever heard this or seen this? I'm not talking about the Catholic Church in excommunication. I'm talking about the way Word of Faith taught us about how the pastor of the church and the elders and the leadership of the church were to conduct matters of discipline in the church. Yep. This is the way we were to do it, see? And we needed to have a particular process. I mean, we didn't want to kick them out of the church too soon. I mean, we give them every chance to write a couple more tithe checks before we actually dismiss them from the church. And listen, if you leave the church, you can send me your tithe check anyway. No. All right. No, here's the thing. Verse 17 is yet a third attempt by an even larger group, by the whole church. You get me? By the whole church to embrace this person, to honor and assure him of his value to the body. How many of us know, and listen, we all know this, how shame and fear can keep you from ever going back into a place where you used to be? Because of what you've done, you're so ashamed of what you did that you do something stupid like hide behind a fig tree while the voice of God is saying, Adam, where are you? Right? Here's the conciliatory one of all times, walking in the garden, and there's somebody who is now ashamed that he's naked, who is afraid because he hears the voice of God in you as you are hosting God, offering reconciliation, so ashamed, so fearful about, shame does horrible things to you, right? So I tell the person, listen, I want to have fellowship with you. Doesn't hear me. I'm not restored to my brother. I take two more that say with me, brother, we want you back in fellowship. We want you enjoying all the benefits of relationship, card night, cigar night, whatever it is, you're missing out on. We want you enjoying that with us. Doesn't hear them either. So now you take it to the church, not to the leadership structure of the church. That's where we've gone wrong, thinking that the church is the pastor and the elders. The church is the people of the church. Right. The church is the people of Jesus, right? Take them to the church. Say, come on, folks, you have been in fellowship with this individual right along with me for a long time, and there has a chasm that has developed here. We don't want that person to be one who has strayed off. There are 99 of us. There's one of them. Let's go get that person. Take it to the church. See what I'm saying? Are you understanding this? We got to have this thing turned upside down in our thinking pretty quick. All right? So in other words, these are like-minded disciples, again, that are going to restore him to the potluck, want to reconcile him once again to the table of the Lord in the fellowship of the body. That's what these people are. These are not people going to confirm at an even louder voice what you've done. You didn't hear one, and you didn't hear three, but you'll hear us. Said no, they didn't hear them either, right? All right, so we come down to the fact that this person, in their shame and their fear, not any other reason, they don't necessarily hate anybody. They're probably within their hearts really very much wanting to grasp on to this olive branch that's being extended, but they are petrified of what their shame, petrified of their shame. I can't go back in that group. That group knows I did thus and such now. Or maybe that person does, or whatever, see? So they won't come back, right? So these are like-minded people. So finally, everybody's reached out to him, and still his own shame and fear excludes him, right? And so now, what are we to do? Finally, we get to excommunicate this bozo. Let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector. Now remember, we are reading a red letter Bible here, which means that we are reading, as it's recorded by the author here, what are perceived to be or the words of Jesus himself. And so when Jesus says, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector, we need to read this like this. Treat them like I treat a heathen and a tax collector. See, we need to treat them like Jesus treated a heathen and a tax collector. All right, so now we will go back to Matthew chapter 9, and we're just about through. But verse 10. Yeah, that's chapter 9, I'm sorry. Yeah, verse 10. Now it happened as Jesus sat at the table in the house that behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. Now notice we've been talking about the intent is to get these people back to the table of the Lord, back into the fellowship of the body. And so we have followed Jesus, we have done what Jesus has asked us to do, and we've done it in a right spirit. We've done it because we understand what we want is reconciliation, right? And so who can we trust to now deal with the heathen and the tax collector? Jesus, who goes and sits with them at table, whether they'll sit at table with you or not. Right. I'm not coming back in. I'm too ashamed of myself. I'm not saying that. I'm not coming back in. I fear the wrath of the crowd or whatever. But we have followed Jesus. We have allowed the mentoring process of Jesus to work something in us that has changed our mind, caused us to reach out differently towards the offender. And now what we can do is we can rest in peace and know that, look at this, let's do it again, as Jesus sat at the table in the house. So this guy goes home, and he sits down at his table, and he gets his bottle of whiskey or his cup of coffee or whatever, and he's going to sit there and just be ashamed of himself further, and he looks across the table, and there sits Jesus. It wasn't bad enough that he sent arms and legs and mouthpieces to me to try to reconcile me. Now he shows up himself. Now wait a minute, Mike, you're telling a fantasy here, only because we don't believe in Jesus. Only because we don't believe in the process of Jesus. The processes that he is. Behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and sat down with him and his disciples. They didn't come from fellowship down at the Baptist church. They didn't just come from fellowship at Father's House Ministry. They didn't just come from meeting. They just came to him without realizing they were coming to him. And when the Pharisees saw it, they said to the disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Then when Jesus heard that, he said to them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. So we're going to go ahead and trust Jesus to go sit at the table with them in their own determined exclusion and tell them, I am not requiring that you sacrifice your place in the body. I'm not requiring that you sacrifice your own good name. I'm not requiring that you sacrifice anything about you, your dignity. I just desire to give you mercy. Amen. Yeah. No requirement at all. Chapter 11, verse 19 again. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is justified by her children. See, there's a friend out there. So even if 1, 3, and the whole glob of us go after him and they reject us, then we can say, Jesus, we have obeyed. And we have obeyed cheerfully. And we have obeyed truly desiring the reconciliation and the restoration of this person to fellowship and to the table. And Jesus will say, I got it from here. Why? Because we have finally done something, church, that we should have been doing for 2,000 years. Instead of excommunicating these people, instead of naming their accusation and heaping upon them shame for their and chapter and verse for what they did wrong, we have finally done what Jesus told us to do. And Jesus said, now you've opened a door for me to do what I do best. I go sit down at the table with tax collectors and sinners. Oh, it gives me goosebumps. When I think of the times that Jesus has sat at the table with me, early on I didn't recognize he was there, but now I do. Not implying that I offend a lot of people and need them to, I understand that. Got to maintain my, Anyway. Luke 15:2 said this, you don't need to, they said, this man receives sinners and eats with them. A long time ago, I looked up that word received. I don't even know where I found it. But one of the meanings of that word received, where it says that this man receives sinners, one of the meanings of that word is he is fond of. This man is fond of sinners and eats with them. Wow. Anyway. So these passages, now I'm going to go back though, and I do want to rely a little bit on chronology. I said in the beginning we can't depend on the chronology, but I was referring to all four Gospels and where things occur. But here you got to remember that chapter 9 and chapter 11 are probably, reasonably close at hand in terms of the understanding of the author as he writes chapter 18. So what that means is the meaning that we've picked up here, that Jesus eats with tax collectors and sinners, is a meaning that we need to carry forward with us when we go over there to chapter 18, because it's still fresh in the mind, of the author. Isn't that right? Okay. So let him be like a heathen and a tax collector means there's no casting out, there's no excommunicating, there's no withholding fellowship, there's only trusting Jesus to bring him alongside, right? Treat him like one who needs to discover the fearless, shameless fellowship of Jesus, the unconditional fellowship of Jesus, I'm going to give you one proof text as we conclude, and I'm not going to comment much on it. Go to Galatians chapter 6. Because as I've tried to do every week, I've tried to show you that Paul really did grab on to the heartbeat of Jesus. And so did Peter, so did James in many ways, okay? Not always do we find real clarification there, but here it is. And we look at Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. Brethren, if a man is overtaken in a trespass. Now, some versions say caught, and so that gives you the opportunity to think you caught him. But that's not what it means. It means ensnared. Some people take pleasure. I caught him. No. If a man is overtaken in any trespass, now listen to this carefully. Because this is the last time that the man who is overtaken in a trespass appears in this passage. He has a cameo appearance just long enough to turn the spotlight fully on you and me. Right? Just a cameo appearance. He occurs in the first line and then he's gone. Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore, reconcile. Such a one in a spirit of gentleness. I could preach all day on this. I'm just going to read it to you. Considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. Bear one another's burdens. Who's the one another he's referring to here? The one who was caught in a trespass or ensnared in a trespass, right? He's saying you bear that one another's burdens. That's what Jesus did. He bore our burdens in his body on the cross. That we, the offender, being dead to sin, should be made alive unto righteousness. And by whose stripes we were healed. See what an honor it is to host God in reconciling. All right, let's do a couple more verses here real quick. For if anyone, still referring to you and me, thinks himself to be something when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each one examine his own work, not the brother who's ensnared in the trespass. And then he will have rejoicing in himself alone, and not in another. For each one shall bear his own load. Isn't that interesting? See, that's just a proof text. Thought you ought to have one. Get anything out of that today?